Hi, I'm Sarah from Woven Rose Needlecraft, and this is the fifth part of the Woven Rose Guide to Cross Stitch, and this part is all about beads. Now, beads are a really fantastic way of adding sparkle and dimension and texture to your piece, and although your first cross stitch piece may not require you to use beads, it is quite likely that if you continue with the hobby, which of course I hope you do, then one day you will be using beads in your piece. So the brand of bead most often used within cross stitch is a brand called Mill Hill. And if I look at my chart here, and just a reminder, this is a paper chart for a piece called Angel of Christmas by Lavender and Lace, which I will be stitching throughout this series. And I once again consult our materials list and skip over thread because we discussed thread last time. I will see here that it says Mill Hill beads, and then beneath that there are 5 symbols, and of course each of those symbols corresponds to a particular bead. Now there is a numbering system used within Mill Hill beads. To be quite honest, you don't really need to know it. All you need to do if you're using beads and if your chart is asking you to use beads is to jot down the number of the beads and then go to your Needlecraft shop, whether in person or online, and find those beads. It really is as simple as that. So most of the time when we are using beads in cross stitch, we will be using these little seed beads, which are just quite standard round beads that are very easy to work with and easy to apply to our fabric. They do come in different sizes. So here we have our standard size seed bead, and beside that we have these absolutely tiny petite seed beads, which honestly are no bigger than a poppy seed. They really are very, very small. One thing you may notice about these two packets is they actually share a number code. So our standard seed bead is 557, which is a very standard gold colour and a very popular colour used in cross stitch. And our petite seed bead is 40557. And that prefix of 40 is simply denoting that it is a petite sized seed bead. So if you see 40 listed on your Mill Hill beads, it usually means that they are the very small petite size bead. Mill Hill beads do come in different sizes and different shapes. So here we have these very large pebble beads. These are actually more similar, I think, to beads that you sometimes see used in knitting and crochet. I don't see very many of these larger beads being used in cross stitch, but occasionally you will see them being used. You might have also seen bugle beads. Bugle beads are the little cylindrical beads. I actually don't have any here to show you. I thought I did, but I couldn't find them. But they're the little cylindrical beads, and they are often used to make kind of chains, decorative chains in cross stitch pieces, and they're really, really beautiful and have a slightly different effect than the standard circular seed bead. The Mill Hill beads do come in different types of finishes. So here we have frosted glass beads, which are slightly more matte, frosted glass of course. And here we have antique glass beads, although we're not using these exact ones in our piece, but I just wanted to show you these have an almost iridescent finish. There are neon beads, there are pastel beads, there are very, very matte beads. There are lots of types of finishes, and your designer will have taken all of that into consideration when choosing which beads they want you to stitch onto the piece that they have designed. Mill Hill also make what are called treasures, and unfortunately we're not using any in our sample piece, but you can go online and see them being used to great effect in other designs. But treasures are little ornaments that you might stitch onto your piece, and often they will take the shape of a leaf or a flower or a star or maybe a shell, and usually you wouldn't use too many in a piece, but they're just a lovely little way of decorating your finished piece and adding another layer of interest and another layer of ornamentation. Of course, Mill Hill are not the only brand making beads, and certain charts, chatelaines for example, may ask you to use other brands of beads. So for example, Delica beads or Swarovski crystals or Swarovski bicones, which are like little ovals. Now those you probably won't be able to get from your Needlecraft shop. So whereas you'll be able to get your chart and your fabric and your threads and your Mill Hill beads from most Needlecraft shops, you may have to go elsewhere to get your Delica beads or your Swarovski beads or other types of specialised beads. And of course there are such things as bead shops, shops that sell only beads, and they do cater quite often to the jewellery making market or to people making clothing who are using beads to embellish their pieces. And they will quite often have these more specialised beads like your Delica beads and your Swarovski crystals and so on. So if you need to use those type of beads, you're probably better off going to a specialist bead retailer. Now, of course, there will be a video later on in this series all about how to attach beads to your piece. But if you are currently in the process of gathering up all of your materials and your tools, there may be a few little bits you want to buy if you're going to be using beads. And the first one is a beading needle. Now, a beading needle differs slightly from a regular tapestry needle that we use in cross stitch, and tapestry needles and cross stitch needles will be talked about extensively in the next part of the series. But beading needles are different in that they're very, very thin, they're quite long, and they're quite bendy. And so those very small beads, which have very tiny little openings, need something like a beading needle in order to be able to get the needle to fit through. You need to be quite careful with these. They are quite fragile. They do have a tendency to snap. Of course, it's very understandable because they're so thin. And really, I keep my beading needles just for beading, and I never use them for any other type of regular stitching. They're just not strong enough for any other work than beading, in my opinion. The next thing you might want to have a look at is some of this, and this is called Nymo, and it is a nylon thread specifically used in cross stitch for beading. Now, that's not to say that you have to use a special thread for beading. A lot of people like to attach their beads using a single strand of cotton, so your DMC or your anchor or your Madeira or whatever, and then they simply match the thread to their fabric, and that works beautifully. I like to use Nymo. To be honest, I couldn't even tell you why. It's just become habit. I find that it's quite flexible. It's beautiful to work with. It's very smooth. It is a little bit more difficult to anchor it in at the beginning and the end when you're using it to make sure that it's secure. But like I said, in the penultimate part of this series, we will be going into beading in detail, and I'll show you the way that I like to use my Nymo. But you absolutely, if you are using beads, you absolutely do not need to have a special thread. Cotton can work beautifully and is favoured by a lot of very experienced stitchers. So in the last video, I said that at this point in the series, I would like to show you another finished piece of mine to hopefully convey how all the materials that we have been talking about can work together to produce something really special. So if you would be kind enough to excuse the framing, because this piece is not in its forever frame, it was temporarily framed and I just never got around to getting it professionally framed. But the reason that I have chosen this piece is because it's not framed correctly, there is no glass, and so there won't be a glare, and you'll hopefully be able to see it a little bit better. But this is the piece I'd like to show you, and this is Angel of the Morning by Lavender and Lace. And this is a piece I finished a few years ago. And I actually remember seeing this piece finished on, I think it was Instagram, years ago. And I was a very new stitcher at the time. And I was stitching little samplers, and I saw this piece. And I remember seeing her face and thinking, how on earth can thread and little tiny stitches create the expression that is on this angel's face? I was completely blown away. And of course, in her face, we are using the little petite point stitches, the quarter stitches, to stitch over one on this linen. And that's what's creating that level of detail and the beautiful expression, I think, the beautiful, kind of sad, but beautiful expression on her face. You'll also see here that she is stitched on linen, which has become a little bit loose, but just ignore that. She's stitched on, I think it was twilight blue or spruce blue linen. It was quite a few years ago, I've forgotten. She's also stitched, of course, using DMC, and we have some metallic thread here in her halo and around her cape and in her sleeves. And then, of course, we have a few beads. Not too many beads actually on this piece. I have stitched projects with a lot more beads. I actually quite enjoy beading, so I don't mind the beads. But I think with this piece, so much of the beauty is in the angel herself, in her face, that perhaps not going too heavy on the metallics and not going too heavy on the beads was a really, really good choice. She is, I think she's still my favourite finish, to be quite honest. There's something about this angel that I really, really love. And actually, I do intend on stitching this particular chart again, which is something I have never done before. I've never stitched a chart twice. It's not something I ever thought I would do, but I would like a bigger version of this particular chart. I think I stitched this angel on 32 count, and I would like a 28 count version, so a bigger version as well. So yeah, that's a finished piece. We'll see if our Angel of Christmas looks anything like this. I can't imagine they'll be too dissimilar because they're obviously by the same designer, but it'll be nice. Maybe at the end we'll put the two of them together and compare. So that's all for our video about beads. To be honest, there wasn't really a huge amount to talk about when it comes to beads. I think most of the information about beads will come later on in the series when we're actually using the beads and applying the beads to our finished piece. But if you have made it through this video anyway, thank you very much. And next time we're going to be talking about tools and accessories, and then we will finally be on to the actual stitching. So thank you and goodbye.